I was looking forward to this conversation to sort of talk about the whole slew of updates and actually hear from folks across different parts of Google. Tulsee Doshi leads our model team inside of DeepMind and is a co-conspirator in launching all these models. Michael leads the Gemini Enterprise Agent Platform, formerly known as Vertex AI team, and is really focused on sort of bringing models to our enterprise customers across the board. And Varun leads the Antigravity team, and lots of exciting updates. Antigravity was sort of, Tulsee, we were talking earlier today, sort of another conduit to bring together the Google ecosystem beyond just Gemini models. So lots of fun, lots of things to talk about. But maybe, Tulsee, we can actually start with the model and sort of Gemini 3 Flash, our best model ever.
3.5 Flash.
3.5 Flash, the most capable model ever that we've shipped. You want to give us sort of the highlight and sort of your reactions now, sort of 24 hours after getting the model out the door?
Yeah, so I don't know if any of you had a chance yet to try 3.5 Flash, but as we announced yesterday, and as Logan just said, we're really excited about this model because it is our best model yet. If you look at it compared to 3.1 Pro, it really actually does better on most of our benchmarks. But I think where we're really excited about it is actually how much better this model has gotten when you look at tool use, when you look at some of our long-running coding tasks, when you actually just look at a bunch of actually more real-world like finance tasks, or as a PM, even things like slide deck creation and kind of like productivity tasks. This model is really good, and I think it has this really nice combination of performance and speed, which actually comes to bear, I think, when you're actually trying to iterate quickly with the model. And so we're really excited about it. It's in Antigravity, so you can try it there, obviously in the API and in AI Studio. What's also been really awesome about this model is it's not just amazing from the developer standpoint, which we'll talk more about, but also it's now in the Gemini app and it's in AI mode, and so it's actually powering a lot of consumer experiences also through its amazing like scaffolding and capabilities there as well. And I think that's been really awesome to see too.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like we sort of, something that you said this morning when we were talking, Tulsee, really resonated. And Varun, maybe I'm excited to hear your reaction to this. There was sort of a comment about, the tension of building a Flash model as we continue to push the frontier of intelligence, and like what sort of Flash means today is actually different than what it meant a year ago, different than even what it meant 6 months ago. And a lot of this is actually grounded in the use cases in which how people are using the model. Like the way that they used to use the model was like, a chat UI, and they were just simply asking questions. And sort of now it's, long-running agentic use cases, and people have a 24/7 agent with, Gemini Spark running behind the scenes. And Varun, I'm super curious from your perspective, like your reaction to that, but also like how you think about like finding the right balance and actually I think like software development's an interesting use case because developers are doing so many different things, and it's difficult to encapsulate software development in like a single action that a developer takes.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Sort of when we started taking a look at some of the Flash models, they were much more, as you said, kind of like AI overviews, AI mode style chat use cases, right? Not a ton of thinking, but then able to maybe take a bunch of search results and then kind of create a good answer. I think what we're seeing now is the Flash models are also able to go for a very long time. Many steps, right? Like I think one of the things that I talked about during the keynote was building an operating system, right? This was 15,000 model invocations that the model went through. I don't think that was the case before, and I think this is a testament to our research team to be able to push these models. In some ways, actually, like, I've seen cases where the model actually will think for 30, 40 seconds on a Flash model, and in the past, that was just not the case. So I think the level of intelligence, agentic capability, right, that the model can actually kind of explore the environment over a very long time horizon, it's kind of changed the way we perceive things. And I think one of the exciting things that we wanted to bring to folks externally that we were seeing internally is just the speed, right? Especially on anti-gravity. I think Flash is already really fast. I think we published some number that it's like over 200 tokens a second, much faster than the other frontier models. But we wanted to give people an even faster experience. And we think this kind of counteracts the fact that, hey, the model is thinking for a while. The model is calling a lot of tools and all this stuff. So it's kind of an exciting time to see both of these things come together.
Yeah, I love that. Michael, something that I feel like the cloud team sort of grounding this moment. Obviously, Vertex sort of renaming to Gemini Enterprise Agent Platform is like a very intentional decision. I think it sort of represents sort of this change of how people are building with the models. I think historically it was, take a model, stick it into some product, do some, chat style UI. I think the announcements from Cloud Next, and I think now coming through I/O, is like very focused on how do you actually build a product around this like new era of models. And I'm curious, like, what your sense is as the future of software development feels like you're going to need agents in order to make that happen. And I'm curious how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, that's a good question. And on the topic of the models, what I'm finding is that the use case drives a lot of how we think about these models, right? It's not a spectrum of intelligence, it's not a spectrum of latency, but it's actually like an easy to describe intentional reason to use a lot of the models. Something like Pro is completely intelligence bound. Something like the modern Flash that we recently released is state of the art on intelligence. When a software engineer writes code, they frequently just like assign a Jira ticket to it. Like it's less and less frequent interacting with your IDE. So you can set it, you can forget it, you get the code back. And in that interaction pattern, the chat UI is really a matter of information retrieval, right? The agent is going along its merry way, trying to solve a problem. It realizes it needs data that isn't written down, so it has to pop up and ask a human to unblock it by providing that information. And in the enterprise, a lot of information isn't written down. I think in our lives, obviously, we don't like store our birthday in a Postgres database. You know what I mean? Like if it needs to know our birthday, it might just ask us, right? And so in that interaction pattern, in the long-running pattern, it's more important that chat is used as information retrieval. Whereas in something like traditional use of Flash, if you're Verizon or it's very common to transact a return for merchants using AI these days. That looks like policy application, and that's very dry. Policy application sounds like it can take as long as you want, but in reality, you have somebody on the phone trying to figure out if you can transact that return. It needs to happen very quickly. You really have a time budget. So in that, you need to be as smart as possible in 250 milliseconds. You have to be very good at determining whether this is in policy, all within 250 milliseconds. And then you lose the customer no matter what. So in that agentic use case, right, you might have sub-agents looking up what the policy are, but you're using a Flash in order to transact the return, and you're just like willing to take the risk of applying the policy incorrectly. And then on the Flashlight side, we have a lot of customers monitoring the entire internet. You can think about, well, actually, I'm not sure I'm allowed to name them, but the biggest companies in the world who have internet scale products that have toxic users need to moderate those things. So for that, or AI overviews on search, right, you don't know how many customers you're going to have. And so as a business, you have to restrict your budget, even if the budget is very large, and you're thinking about infinite scale. So that's how intelligent can I be over infinite scale. All three of those are agentic in nature, and all of three imply different interaction patterns. But we have models for all three. Does that make sense? That's what I'm saying. Yeah,
no, I love this. And actually, it's a perfect segue to, I think even in the future of sort of like, quote unquote, future of software development, there's a spectrum of things that we're seeing. And I think on one end of the spectrum, you have sort of, and actually Andre Karpat, I'm stealing Andre's words, he had the best framing of this that I heard. On sort of one end of the spectrum, you have this sort of vibe coding use case, and the people who weren't building software before are now building software, and sort of the constraints and the requirements for that audience is actually different than sort of the person who's using these tools to build production systems. It's much more agentic engineering. And again, the set of constraints, the systems that you need for that use case is different. I think in the model side, it's actually different too. And I'm curious as you think about this, Tulsee, of like how to balance and whether or not there's like trade-offs between those two things, I'm not sure. Sort of like the vibe coding use case versus the agentic engineering use case.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so, there's a set of foundations that I think are true across all use cases, right? You need the model to have a certain level of reasoning capability. You need the model to be able to call tools effectively. You need the model to be able to understand, for example, multimodal inputs or be able to generate high quality, correct code, right? Those are all things that are true regardless of whether you're talking about the vibe coding use case or whether you're talking about a legacy code base. Yeah. But I think across these use cases, you do want the model to see these different kinds of use cases when you're thinking about training the model. And you also want to evaluate the model's quality across these types of use cases, because it is very possible that you could build in a model that's amazing for vibe coding web applications because it has a certain level of reasoning and has a certain level of aesthetic polish in that it can generate, but it actually really falls over when you give it a legacy system because its understanding of that type of context isn't that strong. And so you actually need to build the model to actually have that sort of variety because you actually need different things. So for example, when you're talking about a code base that is like thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of code, your ability to actually understand that context and use it effectively becomes really important, where that maybe is less important when you're talking about single prompt to web app, right? And so I think it's really for us about really breaking down these different types of like use cases and then actually walking through, okay, what does the model need to be able to do to make these use cases effective? And then how do we actually take our own experiences from the users who are using Antigravity internally and externally, from users who are using AI Studio, from users who are using Canvas in the Gemini app, and how do we actually bring all of that feedback back as we're training the model?
Yeah, Cora, I talked yesterday a bunch about sort of this. Varun, he made some comment to me when we were chatting, which is something to the effect of, it would be hard to actually build a great coding model without this product flywheel. Like it really is an integral part of, and we were talking with Josh this morning about this sort of product model harness symbiosis that sort of exists. And I think Antigravity is sort of playing at almost all three of those different levels. And I'm curious your reaction to that symbiosis, if you agree, but also maybe like the challenges actually of trying to get each stage of those things right. And I think you need all three if you want the flywheel to spin.
Yeah, I think when we started a while back, I think the harnesses were pretty simple in a lot of ways, right? They were simple in that for the most part, they were Bash, maybe a couple file system calls, and then maybe like requesting feedback from the user. But they've started to get more complicated, right? Like right now with Antigravity, the model natively can ask to create subagents. Those can run asynchronously. You can run asynchronous tool calls. This is very important when you run things that are long running. Let's say a researcher spins up a training job. You can't just have it be the case where the agent is blocked until the training job completes and can't really do anything in the meantime. That and maybe like while something is running, the user wants to send a message and then override what the model is actually doing, right? So these are all interesting details that are very specific. And naturally speaking, if all you're doing is pre-training or post-training on lots of data that looks like SWE tasks, like SWE bench style tasks that are just GitHub PRs, you're not going to get those level of detail. And it's very important that we actually train the model to be capable of that, and then also the people that are building the models to see how the current version of the models perform with different harnesses. Right, so that symbiosis is very much felt at this point. So the exact product that people are consuming outside is something that researchers inside are benefiting from, struggling with, and they're like actively trying to optimize. Right, so it's both like, I guess, on the research side, we're actually doing reinforcement learning on the harness, but secondarily also, people are able to feel the performance, right? So now we never get into a state where, let's say someone on research says, we have an awesome model, the benchmarks are awesome, but then we can put it in the product and just immediately say, oh, this is like not very good. Right? We thought that this behavior was very good, but actually in reality, when we play around with it, it's much worse. So that feedback loop is like ridiculously important, both on kind of the vibe side, as you would say, and then the real harness training loop side.
Yeah, there's definitely an empathy building exercise that I think has been really effective here.
Yeah, one of the interesting threads, and Michael, I'm curious, I think some of the tension of this moment that we're in is that every 6 months, the models have shifted so much that the way you actually have to go about building products and building with the products and using the products has to change. And one of the things we were talking earlier this morning, and I'm curious your reaction to this, Michael, is just about like the model sort of like tends to keep like eating certain things, and like the scaffolding layer, the harness layer is maybe one example of this. In the future, it might do a lot of these things. It might be more baked into the model itself. And I'm curious if you just actually, we have probably a bunch of folks who are sort of building with our models, if you have sort of advice or suggestions, how to stay on that frontier, how to make sure that sort of you're making progress with the model and not trying to work against it as progress inevitably continues.
Yeah, there's obviously a tension between what the models are capable of at any one point and trying to predict where they're going to go and building a product that won't deprecate, because you do usually want to build a product for yourself or others now. It's hard to wait for that. But at the same time, like I say, there is this natural tension. So like the conversation over the past, call it since last February, has been all about agent building. And then more and more, what the labs are doing and what we're doing is we're providing an agent API, an agent in the CLI. Like we are providing the agent. and we were offering everybody else to provide it with tools and context and a goal, right? And by training the harness behavior into the model, it's probably better than what most people can accomplish if they build their own agent, right? And so like so the conversation has changed dramatically, even in the last month or two. It went from like help me build an agent to like help me use your agent for my purpose. So both of those exist, and I think they will continue to exist, and we'll have to deal with that. I do think that a lot of the metaphors about treating the model or models harness together as a coworker is pretty valid, right? And so thinking through how do I build something that fails today because the models aren't smart enough, instead of how can I build something that fails today because I built it wrong, that's an enormous difference. And if you're trying to interact with the model and the model is sort of behaving like a poorly performing employee that you hired incorrectly, that's sort of one thing. But we should be thinking in terms of that future term where we can like pair with the model, whether it's on Slack, whether we call the model, we GVC, meet with the model, right? Whether we email with the model. These are just interactions. It should be the same harness. It should be the same model underneath, even if it gets replicated. And then we should think through like how do we want to be using it, and assuming that you three will get us there with a better model.
I love that. We can always have better models.
And that's going to happen. Like I feel like we've been all doing this for quite some time, and we're seeing the models get better faster than ever. Not, you know what I mean? Like I think we can safely bet on that happening. So we should take it as axiomatic and build for that world and fail until the model lets us succeed.
Yeah. One of the questions actually, Tulsee, just for this, part of the tension, I think, of the software engineering story, and I think, Varun, you mentioned something to this point as well, is it becomes increasingly difficult for the actual like evals and the benchmarks that exist in the ecosystem to actually approximate what users are doing for these really, really complicated use cases. And I'm curious, sort of just in the sort of arc of where we are for coding and software development in general, like how you think that is going to end up playing out. Is it just like the way that we measure how great models are at doing all these tasks is going to like require like an actual product in order to do that? Or you can sort of, I feel like a lot of benchmarks these days are almost like approximating products themselves. You have to like build a lot of infrastructure in order to like do a SWE-bench these days, or one of these other benchmarks. I'm curious.
Yeah, I do think, you're already seeing that, to your point, in how our evals are changing, right? Our evals are approximating more product experiences. They need to be inherently more complex if they want to replicate inherently complex tasks, right? Like a fun external benchmark example of this, I guess, would be something like vending bench, right? Which is like literally simulating the ability for a model to run a functional store and earn profit, right? And that's the kind of example of a very complex benchmark that actually measures how the model is able to do this over the span of days. But I also think that one thing that we're realizing, and this goes to Varun's point about like building empathy for the vibes and like really actually understanding kind of real world engineering use cases, is we're also leaning a lot more into even just like live experiments and actual like side-by-side feedback. And I think you're going to need both of these things. I don't think we can just rely on one or the other. We're going to need our benchmarks to get better and more complex, and then we're going to need them to represent a diversity of use cases. But we're also going to need to just keep putting the model in the hands of users, because actually one of the things that I think really has come out to me from a lot of the feedback we're getting from our developers internally and externally is that a lot of the feedback is actually a lot more qualitative and subjective, even in the coding space. I think we often think about coding as like, oh, it's like very verifiable. You can just like, it's either right or it's wrong, and like either you're getting something correct at the end or you're not. But actually a lot of the feedback we get, and Varun should speak more about this too, but is a lot of like the behavior of the model, right? Like how the model actually like talks to you while you're coding, right? The efficiency of the model. And so the laziness of the model or the overeagerness of the model. And like these are all things that you can sort of suss out from benchmarks, but the actual impact they have on a regular developer's experience, I think you really only see in the live experiment and from the feedback. And I think that has become like a really, really important part of the flywheel too.
I mean, one thing that I'm seeing anyway is that the way people use it, and I assume the benchmarks are looking, it's not multi-turn prefill decode, prefill decode, right? It's actually like the model will have to write its own software, run that software, get a return value, and then interleave that with sampling so that it gets more language out and continues to iterate with a workstation, with a computer, right, in the cloud. And so it's not really...
It's not as linear.
It's not as linear anymore,
Yeah.
That's right.
Varun, one of the interesting things is I feel like agentic coding is like probably the first use case where people like really spend a very long time with the model interacting. I think it's actually an interesting wedge to sort of like figure out a bunch of the other things about the model from like a personality standpoint.
Yep.
How eager it is, how does it boast, is it like underappreciating the hard work that it's doing. And I'm curious like if you've sort of felt that as we've done all these LEs and Antigravity, and as the product continues to develop. Also, how to like get people familiar with that experience, because I feel like it's not a muscle that we have. So many AI use cases today, you sort of ask something, you get an answer back, you go on with the rest of your day. You ask for an image, you get an image, you go on with the rest of your day. It's not like deeply multi-turn. I feel like agentic coding is like probably the most notable exception to that.
Yeah. So I guess the reason why coding as a whole was picked was because of what Tulsee said in the beginning. It's very verifiable from one perspective. Like a lot of other sort of fields of knowledge work that are in front of computers, it's not that easy to verify this in the same way. And also it's like very long, right? So you can actually, it's a great problem if you want to test the capability of your model. You can go arbitrarily long, right? Like, you can go from I guess writing like Fibonacci to then building an operating system to building a browser to, I don't know, building Google, right? Technically, there's like a scale of what you could possibly do. I think the reason why like people see this is because, I mean, this is the classic thing. I think for software engineers, actually they do three things, right? The first thing they do is they decide what to build, they figure out how to build it, and then they build it, right? And just the process of deciding what to build and how to build it is a very sort of interactive process, and something you'll need to work with the model to do. Right? And I think at this point we can all say, like, if you have a perfect vision of what you need to do, these models have all gotten to the point where they can just perfectly execute on it. Right? Like if you say, hey, I want you to execute this unit test in this place with this capability, like we can do that amazingly. Right? And the complexity comes from when there are details that are kind of like blurred and not filled in. And that requires some interaction between the user and the model. So you kind of get a feel of like, hey, what does it mean for a model to be well behaved with the user? And this is why this field has become like such a hot area to kind of like improve behavior and stuff like that.
Yeah, I love that. One of the interesting things to see play out, and actually, Tulsee, I think you mentioned this, or actually, no, Michael, you mentioned this. Like the direction of travel is like the models are getting so good at coding. Like I think that's like it's a reasonable bet to assume the trend line continues. Assuming keep working nights and weekends, Tulsee, you and Varun, we'll get better models, sort of they'll keep getting better. 18 months from now, sort of when we've gotten to the point that the models are actually like incredibly good, coding is mostly solved as much as it can be. What's your sense of like where does the bottleneck move? Because the bottleneck moves somewhere else. Like obviously if the like actual, Varun, to your point, like the 3 stages of what people building software go through today, if the last stage of actually executing on the vision and the idea and how you want to solve the problem is solved, I'm curious for all 3 of your perspective about where do the bottlenecks end up in that world as the ability to create software happens very fast?
I mean, I think you're basically gonna push the bottlenecks out in both directions of the actual building, right? So I think on one, you can almost say like you're limited then by your ideas, like you're limited by the part about like what do I want to build, and actually I think then the interesting opportunity for everyone in this room and for all of us is almost like taste, right? Like and actually really identifying what are the problems that are really important to solve. Because when building is so easy, it's very easy to then build for problems that maybe even aren't real problems, right? And I liked how Josh said this earlier today, like really find the pain points for users. Yeah. And like, I think your limitation then is like, are you finding a real pain point and are you actually able to solve for that? But then you also have the problem on the other side, and you're gonna have bottlenecks on that side too, which is just because you've built a product, do you have like the capacity to scale that product? And like, do you have the ability to scale that to the set of users you want to scale? How do you reach those users? How do you design the product in a way that it is like understandable and grokkable and easy to use? And I think you're going to see bottlenecks on both of those. And so it's going to be more and more important that we start building that kind of muscle of not only how do you design an amazing product, but then how do you actually deploy that product.
I love that.
I think there's a very clear bottleneck today in information retrieval, and sort of like in the future, software development will get easier and easier and easier and easier, and at one point maybe that won't even matter, but any process bogs down, any blocking node in any process is usually because there is some sort of like authority that needs to be given or information that needs to be retrieved in order to continue the process. And that's definitely true. I mean, less true in getting a product to production, but I don't think it's that controversial to say it's much easier to build a coding agent than an SRE agent. An SRE agent has to continually query the state of an etcd cluster and make a next step and a plan based on the most recent state of the etcd cluster, of a Kubernetes cluster, right? But in software, usually all information that you need is already written down, and you get in a task, and it can run for a long time without hitting a blocker like that. So there's plenty in software development that we're going to get over by solving these information retrieval bottlenecks. And there's probably plenty in the SDLC, if not in the authorship of code, that already the models are intelligent enough for, and that IR problem is already the bottleneck. That, like testing software, like deploying software and keeping it up and keeping it secure, and you might need access to a database in order to do a unit test with real data, stuff like that. So I think there is this like very real IR problem that the agent harness contemplates that is different than intelligence, which the model contemplates. And by solving both together, we can get a very long way.
Yeah, just to double click on this, I'm curious. Like obviously, developers have been doing RAG and sort of some amount of like information retrieval. But
that's all preparable data, right? Like again, that's not interacting with a customer to make sure that you can transact a return in a real situation, or a bank's KYC process. There are 2 banks that I know that are running their Know Your Customer process with the models, which means that not only do I have to look up a very wealthy individual to determine whether or not they sit on a board with somebody from a banned country, and they might be a money laundering risk, but I actually know who that person is. I've run a background check. The bank has run a background check on them. And that's very sensitive data. Actually, these 2 banks are credentialing their agents to that very sensitive data. But they're only doing it now because they know that data won't be exfiltrated. Before that, the model was intelligent enough. One bank did this in May, the other the next October. So quite a bit away. So that's not because the model got smart enough. That's because the bank figured out how to solve the IR problem with the right level of credentialing to run the process. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I feel like that is the where a lot of the frontier challenge is actually moving to, is how to.
And the models can write good SQL. They can even plan and say, I need information I don't have, instead of going ahead and hallucinating. But that's a software problem and not a model problem in many ways.
Yeah.
It's also it's a software problem. It's also in many of these cases, like a safety and security. Like there's a number of these other layers to this that are a part of this problem.
100%. So those are bottlenecks that I see coming up.
Varun?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think people somehow believe with AI we're just gonna get products that already exist are gonna get way more. There's gonna be way more stuff in them. I actually believe that it's very hard to even decide what to build. Yeah. Right? Like, if I take any product that is good today, I can't just add 100 buttons and be like, oh, this button does X, this button does Y, and expect my users to get the sum of all of those capabilities of a button. I know a lot of products that look like this. Don't want to call them out, some enterprise products that look like this. But I think that's just a tough problem to solve, right? So you're going to have, I think the people that are going to shine are the people that are going to be incredibly high agency. They can make hard calls. Right? These are very tough to make. Like users cannot take in hundreds of things, and that's going to be what's in very short supply, and that's what I think builders should really focus on, and that's going to be the hard skill that we're all going to be trying to build. Right? What should we be building? Is the hard problem, right? And I think that's always been the hard problem. Yeah. Right? It's never been I think. A lot of crazy stuff has been built at Google. I think the hard question is not how does this piece of infrastructure, this crazy piece of infrastructure work? We have Spanner, we have all this crazy stuff in Google Cloud. It's what should I actually be building is the hard problem.
Yeah, it's a great question. What should people be building? I have a couple more questions that I'll ask you, and I want to make sure we get time for audience Q&A. So if you have questions for our lovely panelists, please queue them up, and then somebody somewhere will have a microphone for you to ask the question. One of the other ones that's very top of mind is sort of as the way we interact with agents continues to change. I'm curious, like this interface layer matters a lot. Varun, you showed sort of like the, talking to the model. We had this with Google Docs yesterday and being able to talk to the model. Feels like audio is like obviously one of those paradigms. Other thing, maybe it's just audio, but like other ideas or comments just sort of about how that interface layer is actually changing and how it is actually tied in a lot of sense to not only the model capability powering it, but sort of how you can sort of rewrite the interface because
how you like redesign
for this new era. Yeah.
And I think it contemplates both quite carefully, right? If we redesign for the model to interrupt us, to unblock it, it has to have a sense of savoir-faire. It has to know if it pings us and we were too busy to respond, should it be persistent? Should it ping us 3 more times? Or should it wait an hour and then ask us the same question? Or should it just like, this is not important to this person? Do you know what I mean? And like that interaction is going to be very tricky to get right because nobody wants, like everybody's gotten called like 1,000 times from a very persistent salesperson or something that's very annoying. And we don't want, like, if we move into a fully agentic world where our agents are coworkers and we expect them to have agency and good judgments, then when should they ask us for help? I think is a very careful question that we'll have to contemplate.
Yeah, it's a good push.
I guess I really believe audio is going to be very big. It's clear we haven't like completely cracked it. Like obviously I do use live voice transcription like very quickly. It's in Antigravity. It's something I use. I also use it on other apps as well. But it feels like it could be so much more powerful, right? Like imagine a world in which you have 100 agents kind of running. I don't even know which agent is which. I want to be able to talk to my machine and for it to kind of like tell me like, hey, here's what's going on right across all of your agents that are running. We're not quite there yet, but I'm sure that's in the works. Like we'll figure that out.
I think it's also interesting. This goes to a debate we were having this morning about whether we think that the paradigm of building products is going to lead to like thousands and thousands of products, or whether it's going to lean down to one product. And I think like the question that I think is going to be really interesting in all of this is like, do we in these 2 examples, there's sort of this implicit assumption that like we'll get to a world where there will be almost an interface, right? Maybe you talk to it with voice, maybe you do something else. That then can spawn off a bunch of agents that can actually go do a number of things for you and kind of come back or proactively reach out. And so there's this kind of interesting shift then that would happen from a world where you have like 20 different apps to do 20 different things for you, where you're going to app A for X and then app B for Y, to a world where maybe you actually have a much simpler view of the world, where you're actually saying, okay, I trust this interface. I'm going to ask this interface a bunch of different things that I need to get done. And I'm going to trust that it can actually find the right product solution for me. And that is a pretty big shift in design principle and a pretty big shift in how you would approach product making, I think.
And not to like lean too heavily on the metaphor, but again, this is how humans work, right? A human is a person, whether they're calling you, they're the same person, it's to say, whether they're choosing to call you and their interface is a phone, or they want to chat you and they're being very precise and you can read every letter, or they want to email you, or like there are many ways that we interact with each other. And we have good judgment for when to do it. A call is always interruptive. I'm not going to call Sundar on the telephone and expect him to pick up, right? So again, like the agent is the person, is the product. The interface should be chosen by the agent to be appropriate for the interaction, right?
Yeah. All right, my last question, and then we'll go to audience Q&A. If you could sort of wave the magic wand and sort of have a new sort of model capability or a product capability, anything on y'all's sort of personal wish list? And I'd actually love to hear the answer to this from the audience as well, maybe after the session. But yeah, anything for you all that you would love to sort of wave the magic wand and be able to fix or have?
I mean, I can tell you one that is very random and probably not that helpful to a wide range of people. But I'm a dancer, and one of the things that I've been trying to do for a long time is actually like leverage our models to actually help me with choreography. And it's actually been harder than I thought. Even the parts that I thought would actually be easy to automate. Part of that is like something very simple, which is that in order to upload a video and have the model be able to do useful things with it, the model has to be able to consume a very fast set of frames per second, because dancing moves very, very quickly. Yeah. And so there's like literally this like actual like physical constraint on what the model is actually able to even understand and consume to then be able to actually even give you actionable insights. And so it's one of those things that like actually is not just a model problem, it's also like a system problem. And then there's actually a model problem. And creativity in that format of something like choreography is also very hard, right? How do you help the model understand lyricality, for example, which is like a very specific thing that you would want to build. And so it's one of these interesting things that I've been thinking about in the context of Omni and in the context of multimodal understanding, both of which are things that Gemini is very good at, but actually is difficult in something where you get to like one of these more creative spaces.
2 quick plugs. We have dynamic FPS in the Gemini API, so if you want to sort of toggle the FPS for things like sports or whatever, you're analyzing your golf swing, analyzing sort of dancing,
it is very effective.
It does exist.
Yes.
It's very effective. You should also build choreography bench. I like this. It's a good the new hottest AI benchmark choreography bench. So I'm excited to see it. Tulsee, Michael.
I mean, mine is so much more boring than that. I feel like, but thematically similar in some ways. Like I talked earlier about the difficulty of building an SRE agent. I worked in a couple jobs ago at a company called Datadog, and I've been thinking a lot about our customer who gets woken up, and I'm sure everybody here has had this experience, gets woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and they're not the only ones in their house that wake up, right? Their spouse wakes up, their dog wakes up, their baby starts crying, their spouse hates them because they're a lawyer and they have a big client meeting in the morning, like everything goes to mess, and they do this for long enough, they get divorced. You know what I mean? Like, I think about this software engineer who's on call all the time. And I would very much like an agent who can staunch most problems most of the time, who can like maintain a distributed system of arbitrary scale, something the size of a Capital One or an Airbnb. Do you know what I mean? And I think some of the limitations to that is this ability to fill the context window in real time at high frames per second, using a metaphor, right? Is to push information as it streams in about a ludicrously complicated system and spend most of your time reasoning about that, not writing queries to get the data necessary. It's like less of a query and response and more of a streaming mechanism, I think.
Yeah.
But either way, that's like, I'm very excited for that world because it's entirely possible and we're getting there and a lot of people are working on it. So,
I love it. Varun?
Yeah, I mean, for nothing that complicated. I just wanted a personal trainer app. I feel like I'm kind of lazy, so just something that kind of watches what I'm doing and tells me like you shouldn't eat that or you should go run outside.
See, that's dangerous. Like, I'd rather not know.
Well, maybe we'll have that with glasses in the fall.
Yeah, with glasses
powered by
and
Gemini,
Fitbit.
Gemini Live, and Fitbit, exactly.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
almost
Awesome.
there.
Well, I would love to hear some questions from the audience. I have no idea where the microphone is, if it already exists and is in somebody's hand.
Yeah, we have 2 microphones on both sides of the audience. You can line up back here, and we have about 8 minutes for questions.
I love it. If you have questions, please feel free to go to the microphone. You have to. We're gonna make you do the old-fashioned walk to the microphone.
And please queue up. Feel free to,
We'll start over here.
My question's for you, Varun. So you were saying that, in the future, like, you really like how you have audio interactions with these AI agents and stuff. What do you think, like, in the future, developer AI agent interactions going to look like? Is it going to be more like visual or is it going to be more audio based? Like, what's your intuition on that, like in the upcoming years?
Yeah, I think we've been talking a lot about that on the team. It's weird. Like, what is the best way to input information? I think voice is fast. Technically, you can do some crazy stuff. Like, you could do voice, your hands and your feet. So you can start tabbing with your feet technically, just to get the fastest amount of input in. I don't know if people would want to do that, but probably not, right?
Sign me up. This sounds fun.
Yeah, maybe soon.
Like a dance activity.
Yeah. So I think voice in sounds the most compelling, right? From like a data perspective, I think a lot of people are lazy to read, but reading is like way faster than listening. So in some ways, like the reason why I brought up the thing of like, hey, you can spin up as many agents as possible. It's very clear that's where things are going, right? Like the agents are going for longer and longer. You're probably gonna have many agents running for you in the background, and being able to quickly talk to it regardless of surface seems like the right play. I think there's maybe a little bit of awkwardness that if you work in an office, like you don't want everyone just talking and yelling at the same time. So we need to figure that part out. And then maybe consuming it. I don't exactly know what the best way to consume it is. Maybe it actually is like text. I don't exactly know. One crazy thing about the way you could input stuff is, I think we were talking in the office, we were saying, people that are Smash players, people that play Smash, they're really fast at moving things. I think they're like potentially as fast as you talk. So maybe there's like also a new form factor to start like inputting data into these machines. I don't really know. I think someone should do some analysis on this.
Yeah, thank you. Second thing was I wanted to ask is that, do you think gesture is gonna play like a big role in spinning up agents or like orchestrating, like how you have your Google Watch, let's say, like the Pixel Watch, or like the Apple Watch, you just spin up an agent on your Apple Watch or Google Watch with just hand gestures. Is it gonna be like possible in the future?
That would be cool. Yeah, that sounds awesome. You should do that.
I know, that sounds awesome.
Thank you so much.
Hey, so I have a question. So we have the text prompt and voice prompt, but what about the people that like are more visual, though, or have the lack of communication skills? So how the AI will overcome those like barriers that people? I mean, with other people we can use hand gestures and everything else that we could communicate, but over text or over voice, we don't have that kind of skills. So how the AI will overcome those barriers?
Good question. I feel like video and image is an interesting. Like I think one of the cool things is if you have, if you could, draw something out, if you could, if you could sort of like express it like physically, back to like this like dance example. Like I do think the model being able to natively understand image and audio, and actually like we were talking earlier today about like subtly picking up on like the intonation of your voice as you sort of try to express something, even if it's not in the most perfect way, are all things that the model can actually do natively, which I think is super interesting. And yeah, maybe we need like new form factors, and maybe it's gesture or.
I mean, even with our existing form factors, right? I was working with somebody at work the other day, and no matter how well articulated you are, it's much harder to describe where on the screen to move your cursor than to just fucking point at it. You know what I mean? And I think a lot of input will look much more like tapping the screen or lassoing something, or just like gesturing at what you mean, and that'll be the kind of interaction.
It also probably depends, like, depending on the use case and also your personal style too, right?
Yeah.
So, like, for me, I'm someone who very much, like, thinks while talking. Like, I also, like, find myself to be a very verbal communicator generally. So I prefer that form factor. I prefer audio, right? But for someone like my sister, I actually think she would do a lot better with a form factor where she had the time to sort of, like, write something out or draw it or move things, and like she's a much more visual communicator and a visual learner, and so that would be like a much better form factor for her. And so I think actually part of what we need to build and design is interfaces that can be flexible to who you are and how you communicate and how you engage, and then there's a lot more of that. Like, I mean, there's been a lot of talk for a long time about personalized learning, but I think there's also probably personalized creating, and there's both of those that are effective, I think.
Yeah, my fun fact is my new 20% project at Google is I actually ghostwrite Tulsee's tweets now, and so she dictates to me, and I sort of write them down because she's very audio, and I can do the writing.
Yeah, so everyone, just stay tuned. It's going to be great.
And so sometimes actually
all of your tweets are just Gemini now.
Yeah.
The tongue-in-cheek comment is like actually sometimes it's another human in the loop. Like AI systems obviously are super helpful, but sometimes you actually can get a friend or somebody that you work with to go and help. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
I think we have time for about 1 to 2 more questions.
All right, so one of my biggest bottlenecks is speed, right? But the penalty for writing bad code is sometimes really big. So generally, you want to run the best model. Kind of where do you feel we are on that kind of scale for we have a really fast model that's good enough for 99.9% of the time, and then we just optimize for speed, and then we just have one big model to just reality check things at the end?
I think we genuinely believe in this idea. Like, honestly, one of the things that we have in Antigravity that's pretty awesome is we have subagents, but actually the model, the main agent is able to actually pick the model for the subagent. So I think we could totally see a world, especially given we're in a world where there's we don't have unbounded number of chips where a big model is able to kind of delegate to smaller models. I think right now we're not at the stage right now where we're purely optimizing for like how do we save everything rather than capability, because it's kind of like what you said. Probably in a lot of workloads you don't just only want to run the smallest model possible, right? You would rather have it be the case that the hit rate is a lot higher than have a small model look at it and then every once in a while you're like, what's going on? But 100%, this is the direction of travel. Like, I think we will see a world in which bigger models are delegating to smaller models to do a vast majority of work.
Thank you.
Yeah, it'll save a lot of tokens too. And our last question.
Hey guys, so my name is Karthik. So regarding the tests and how we develop our software, is there any framework or like steps that you guys recommend for using to avoid AI slop? So for example, if I build an entirely new product and then if I want to add a new feature, I don't want to break the existing features, right? Is there any ways to avoid all of that? Is it just unit tests and integration tests, or is that more that I'm missing in the whole picture?
I think right now, we actually think about this pretty deeply when we're building Antigravity. How do we make Antigravity kind of build itself? And I think you need to kind of be a little mindful at the beginning of the project. So for instance, let's say you're building like an application. I would actually make it so that from the very beginning of the application, the agent itself can spin up the application, click buttons on the apps, and you actually have these kinds of smooth integration tests. And you can imagine... That's fun. Sounds like I'm in the restroom of like an airport. No, so I think the idea is like try to make it so that the agent itself is testing your app, and you can convert this into a pretty high quality test, right? Imagine doing that, generating playwright of exactly what it clicked, and then afterwards offline doing that, right? So you can convert these agentic tests into like more robust tests afterwards. So I think there is like a new paradigm now that agents can test things very quickly. You should be leveraging that maximally.
What about existing products? Say if I have,
Yeah, I think you'll need to re-architect pieces of existing products. That takes a lot of work, I would say. It's better when it's 0 to 1.
I think, and actually just to echo one quick point, I think this goes back to the conversation from before about sort of this agentic engineering discipline being different than vibe coding. And I think the framework that you have for agentic engineering like looks different than I think if you're just like YOLOing your own personal project where there's not users and you don't need to worry about anything breaking. I think the frameworks actually look different. I think we as an ecosystem sort of need to actually have that materialize in how we build and talk about this stuff. So thank you for that question. Varun, Michael, Tulsee, thank you for sitting down and doing this. This was an awesome conversation.
Great.
And please join me in giving them a round of applause.
And thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone.